Okay, let's go. Heidegger, relevance. Poop on Descartes. Oh, although I guess we only got barely started on that.
Yeah, you just got worked up.
Yeah, I'm actually looking forward to the Descartes part because I I'm very interested to see how he sees his project in relation to Descartes. So didn't say much this time, but I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes. I don't know. Does anyone have any place they particularly want to start?
I will say that I read for today. I just finished the reading like maybe 15 minutes before the meeting but I was catching up. So I did everything from last week plus this week. Um, brain's a little like, but um, I it reminded me like I guess for the stuff from last week, the problem was that like the stuff from last week, I really wish I would have been here for. Um, just because a lot of the um things discussed were kind of thematically elements of the mysterious essay that I got Mario and also Enrique to like glimpse at and from Fichte's work on signs, and that was very interesting. I think I'd like to see that the German text looks like to see if there's like shared terminology. Um, and I'm also reading Beiser right now at the same time, so I'm like give me quick check from the section we read this week. It seems as if we're the focus on getting to the world. To get to the worldhood, we're getting to Dasein first. Like by trying to answer the question about worldhood, we have to look at Dasein. That's the reason why we get to Descartes at the very end of of our reading.
Um, I thought he was trying to get to worldhood in order to as one of the elements of being in the world.
Okay, okay.
I mean, I think we had some disagreement about that. Was it last week? But I thought he was trying because worldhood was one of the existentials, I guess, of Dasein, and uh, I'm looking at Chase's face and seeing if that was correct. But
Yeah,
um,
yeah, no, I think that's totally correct, at least as far as I know.
so it seems like he was trying to get to figure out what worldhood and worldliness, which I'm not sure I know what the difference between those two are, or if there is one, in order to be able to better understand what being in the world is. So,
Hmm.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know why I do the I, sorry, I apologize about clearing my throat. It makes me seem like pretentious or whatnot, like I'm about to announce something. Like I don't know. But really it's like I actually had something in my throat I need to clear.
Please
But
don't worry about stuff like that. You're fine.
okay, excellent. Thank you. Um okay, sorry. But yeah, I think that's right. The we're trying to we're examining the worldhood of the world, which is I think that's kind of the ontological aspect of the world and his sort of his definitions of world that he's got. The worldhood, which I think is the same thing as worldliness, I think. I hope so. So that's what's going on. He's trying to do the ontological aspect of the world as part of being in the world. And I'll just reassert that I think I was right that the world um is a not a component, but a whatever his term is for, that basically means the same thing as a component of being in the world, which is that's the being of Dasein, is being in the world. So we're looking at world, then we'll look at being with, and then being in, and it's kind of goes through and kind of sections off these different aspects of being in the world and shows how they ultimately kind of connect up. But yeah.
Yeah, and at least the way I was reading it, I was getting the sense that he's sort of trying to I mean, and he's just beginning to lay out Descartes' framework, but he's spending all his time talking about relevance and all this, and it seems like a big part of that is that for like because it's being in the world as part of Dasein, all this, that it's like the world is there for Daseins in a way, like there's no world independent of Daseins and vice versa, and the world is like the way that that things are manifesting for Dasein to comport itself in relation to. And that's, I think he's trying to distinguish that. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, if people are getting something else, but I see that as he's trying to distinguish his view where the world is sort of presenting itself to Dasein or whatever to Descartes, where Descartes' notion of world is something analogous to like spatiality or like extension, that there's these things, and so it seems that maybe for Heidegger, the world isn't identical to just spatiality, that there's maybe even things in the world, quote unquote, or whatever we're talking about with worldliness, that's not just reducible to that it exists in space, or has like spatiality and extension and stuff.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Wanted to point out a piece on page 1 or Heidegger 82, but Robinson, Macquarie 113. And my disclaimer, I didn't get to the Descartes piece of this reading, but digesting a lot of like the earlier part of the section where he's just really deepening into this, what I see as like the like a priority of ready-to-handedness, and really kind of, I'm guessing he's setting up his objection to Descartes, who I'm based on the Stanford Encyclopedia, that's the only exposure I have to his relationship to Descartes, where they're talking about like Heidegger's trying to argue that present to hand is not in any way like primary, and then kind of like has readiness to hand or value that's like then laid over it. And then on page 113, just like over the overall project, Heidegger 82, I thought was really interesting because the relationship to worldhood, of worldhood to Dasein, being in the world, to the question of being. This is the bottom of that paragraph on Heidegger 82, where he says, in an understanding of being is constitutive for primitive. He's talking about like the primitive and like what might be different about looking at primitive Dasein versus like nowadays Dasein. I was reading him as saying that like potentially worldhood is not present for like primitive Dasein, and that I'm just kind of running with this theme we were talking about last week around to what extent does time play a factor in the changing of being for Heidegger, and where he stands compared to other philosophers like Hegel, and people who have taken a clear position on that stance.
Where is that you're seeing that? The primitive Dasein?
This is Heidegger 82. Kind of all over that page, he's just like getting into this idea of like the primitive Dasein doesn't have objectification, or it hasn't discovered equipment. Like there's not a world there, but it's more so like this this coinciding of signs with like they're immediately what they mean, as opposed to like pointing to things. He's talking kind of about like magic and fetishism. I wouldn't claim to fully understand, but I just thought it was interesting that he seemed to be painting a distinction between primitive Dasein and the Dasein that we can look at as our everyday experience. And what I see him saying as like readiness to hand and equipment have nothing to contribute as ontological clues in interpreting the primitive world. Then he goes on to say, like, being is constitutive for primitive Dasein, the primitive world in general. It is all the more urgent to work out the formal idea of worldhood, or at least the idea of phenomenon, modifiable in such a way that all ontological assertions to the effect that in a given phenomenal context, something is not yet such and such, or no longer such and such, may acquire a positive phenomenal meaning in terms of what it is not. I'm that kind of sentence just stood out to me as like, there's maybe this larger idea of like to what extent is being changing, or is Dasein capable of like Dasein's mode of being, or however we might phrase it, capable of change. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there from the theme that we talked about last week.
So I thought, again, possibly wrongly, that he was saying that primitive Dasein does have a world and is being in the world, but that it is so deeply embedded in the world that that's not the way he would put it, but that what it lacks is this ability to objectify. And so that's, I mean, I here, so it's been, I haven't read this since last week, but just kind of skimming through it, it's like primitive Dasein is so much enmeshed in its world that it can't it doesn't have this ability to abstract away these signs and think of things in these as objective separate existence, but that it's like like thoroughly, like the relationality is so deep, it's just thoroughly enmeshed in its world. That was the sense I got, was that it did have that primitive Dasein has a world, it is being in the world, but the character of that world is different from, I don't know what, post-Greek Western consciousness or something, Western world or something like that. But
I mean, maybe he thinks that there are just fewer I mean, certainly it doesn't seem like a crazy claim to say that primitive people have far fewer signs to work with, and so the kind of the number of references that a sign can have and the interactions it could have are much smaller. So I think you're right that it's probably a simpler environment. Um,
Uh,
yeah, go ahead.
I it just sounded very anthropological to me, that when he was talking about primitive Dasein, he was talking about primitiveness in terms of the human culture in general. And I didn't get a sense that he was using primitive in a pejorative way, but rather just as a word, a concept to compare it to, I don't know, the modern. And some of the anthropology I have read about trying to get back to, very simple societies, even if they're beyond hunting and gathering, there is a sense that instead of asking a general question, it's more like, why did that person die? Right? I mean, it's their cosmology is very specific to what's happening to individual human beings. That it was just a different way of looking at the world. It wasn't like, oh, well, if you do this, any human being who does these three things is increasing the likelihood of buying the farm. But instead, this person is dead. How did that happen? And that there also was, in terms of earlier human understandings, there wasn't stark separation between religious and secular. That there, you had animism, totemism, and so you didn't have these separations that we are very comfortable with in the modern world. For them, it would have been, I hate to use the word mosaic, but of whole cloth. And that's what I thought that Heidegger was getting at.
Yeah,
Yes. Oh,
good.
okay. So, um, yeah, the thing that he's talking about with primitive Dasein, especially with signs, is that the sign coincides with what it indicates. And he says that that's because it's absorbed in the being of what's indicated. So there is a kind of absorption of the sign and the context of referentiality that he talks about is constitutive of the world. So I definitely think he's saying that there's a primitive world, but I think kind of like Nevin was saying that the primitive world does primitive Dasein is absorbed in it and uses signs in it in a way in which there isn't a detachment of the sign from what it indicates. Which actually, okay, so I hate to mark off my bingo card for this, but it kind of reminds me somewhat of in Anti-Oedipus, the difference between the primitive territorial machine, in which I think it's something like that. The sign coincides with what it indicates. In that case, it's kind of markings of the body and things like that. But then when you get to the imperial despotic machine, then you get this deterritorialization of the sign from what it indicates. You start to get some kind of like linguistic abstraction going on. So I think that's kind of the transition that he's referring to here. And at the same time, this is also, Deleuze and Guattari, they're also basing their idea of the primitive territorial circuit based off of anthropology and ethnology and whatnot. And I think, Heidegger doesn't cite anybody here. I think he's also thinking something along that, fetishism and magic. You've got Freud talking about the same thing. Before, yeah, it was before this, I think. But yeah, so that's what I think. I mean, so one thing, so when I read the thing about how the at hand in the world does not have the okay, so it seems like he's saying that the ready to hand isn't really a thing in the for the primitive world or primitive Dasein. But I think what he's saying there, I might be wrong about this, but is that that's not kind of indicative of the difference between what makes the primitive world. As in, it's not just that it's totally absorbed in the ready to hand, and that's what marks its difference versus non-primitive Dasein, where it has, okay, that has ready to hand or doesn't have ready to hand. But yeah, the thing he talks about though is that objectification, where he's saying that in fact, there isn't that objectification that I guess some theorists presume is the basis of the way that signs operate in fetishism and magic. And he's saying that no, that's not the case. And that's the kind of present at hand interpretation that he's saying. It's not operating in either the primitive world or in the modern world. Although in the modern world, it comes to have this kind of secondary characteristic that sort of papers over what is ready to hand, where I think the ready to hand primitive Dasein is so immersed in it, coinciding with it, that it doesn't appear as something, which is kind of so that's the thing that the sign is the sign. Okay, I know he says this explicitly, but it's that the sign is something ontic, but it works through through reference in a way that it requires this whole context of relations in order to have relevance, and then that relevance as this context of relations. That's what's ontological, and that's what really constitutes the worldhood of the world, is this quality of embedded relations that give relevance and meaning to things. Which, I don't know, that this last section 18 on relevance and significance, I was extremely dense, and I kind of gave up on a few of these sentences. I was like, oh God, what the hell? Like, I don't, yeah, just underline it as if I know what it means and move on. Yeah.
When you say relevance and significance, might that in my version be reference and assignment?
I think those are actually,
Section 18?
Oh, in
yeah,
8 have
yeah, 18.
involvement and
Yes,
significance.
involvement and significance.
Okay.
Yeah, so relevance and the new translation, I guess, is involvement, and the old translation.
I guess involvement and relevance, that's not too far off of it as translational differences though, I don't think.
That's
As far as what those two words would imply.
I think there's a long note in the M&Q version about their choice of involvement. For some reason, involvement to me has maybe like more a feel of like a cog in a machine, that makes sense to me in the way that Heidegger talks about readiness to hand, whereas relevance maybe feels a little bit more like cognitive linguistic meaning. Involvement is like, for me, like being in the world, I like the idea of involvement seems a little bit more like embodied moving parts, which makes sense of this like totality of kind of tools or equipment that are there to be in service towards something.
I mean, I did find myself, I think incorrectly, initially thinking of these terms as linguistic, like signs and all of the, it sounded like it was, in reference and that sort of thing. And so I think I think those translations and the newer one invites that, but whereas I think that's not what he's saying there, because later, he says language then kind of is a secondary, or not a secondary effect, but is made possible by these more basic ontological whatever they are. So I mean, once I kind of figured out that's what he was doing, then I was okay. I'm like, oh, this isn't primarily a linguistic relationship that he's talking about here. But it did take a few pages for me to kind of catch that because of the choice of those terms in the new translation. But once I got that, it was okay, because like when I think of once I got where I realized he was talking about this more ontological thing, then when I read relevance, I started thinking of it as it's relevant to my world. Like a hammer is relevant to what I'm trying to do here, whereas some unrecognized, I mean, there could be something laying around in the workshop that actually might be a tool for some other culture or some other, but I just wouldn't even recognize it as a tool, because it just has no relevance to me. It has no relevance to the possibilities of action for me. So once I started thinking of relevance in that term, in that sense, then I was okay.
So I'm sorry, I have a question just to go back to the point that Joey brought up. I guess I'm not totally understanding what the significance of that passage is. Like, why again take time to try to mark a difference between primitive Dasein and contemporary Dasein? Can someone offer an explanation?
I would like to make a stab at interpreting what I think Chase said. I'm sorry I'm talking so much, but this when he was talking. So if I understood Chase, and when I was reading back through the text on that paragraph, what he was saying seemed to be borne out. That the difference he's pointing to between so-called primitive Dasein and contemporary Dasein isn't that we have access to objective presence or ready to hand, and primitive Dasein didn't, but that to emphasize the fact that in his view, handiness, or is that present at hand? Is that the equivalent of handiness? Or is that the other one? I get the two.
No, I'm afraid
Oh,
not. Handiness
damn it.
is ready to hand.
So Randy,
Yeah.
okay, so what I said was just backwards. So, but that we, that there's the contemporary view tends to think of objective presence or present at hand as being primary, and then these other modes being kind of like epiphenomena that ride on top of this fundamental objective presence. And that if I understood what Chase was saying, part of the point of this paragraph is to say, no, look, what primary really is this handiness, this ready to hand, and you already see this in this primitive Dasein. Primitive Dasein didn't have this, somehow constructed this theoretical objective presence with objective objects in a world and collections of unrelated things that we then have to figure out how to use. No, that's not what primitive humanity had access to, was the immediacy of handiness and ready to hand. And so then that's still our fundamental inheritance, is that mode of being. And then you have these theoretical modes of being that emerge after the fact. Is that about right, Chase?
Yeah, definitely.
Potentially a really stupid question, but I is primitive is the so I guess like it's he's not I have a sensation, I guess, is that primitive man is only like referred to just so that like um I don't know, to maybe open up the imaginative space for the reader to view Dasein or beings like us um in a situation where we're not so inundated by uh, technology equipment. Um, would that be because I don't know, I just didn't get the sense that he would break up the like humanity into like, or I guess it's not really the case that there's like there was an evolutionary like leap in human beings such that like primitive man was such that this was just obvious to them, then we lost it for some reason. I was reading it more in the long lines that he just kind of deployed that as a method to get us to think along the lines that you just outlined. It's easier, I guess, to imagine that I would view things ready to hand. If it just wasn't the case that like things just weren't there for me all the time. I feel like that's like the thing is like I walk around and there's just so much shit that it just feels like it's all there already. Like the objects are given. Does that make sense at all? Am I for Rocker? I wasn't necessarily James. I was saying like just generally to the community. That I don't necessarily think that he's like saying that there's primitive men, there's modern future men, there's men abound. It's raining men. There's one man.
I thought
Well, I
I was
thought
looking at ideationally. I mean, conceptually, how do people conceive of things around them? It wasn't so much that we're more complex in terms of our social and technological organization. It's just as how do we conceive of things? What I mean is, think of little kids, if they have a dog at home and they recognize a dog that to us would be the same breed, but it is a completely strange dog, many times children's level of conceptualization is, oh, that's another Sparky. You know, they won't say German Shepherd. They won't even maybe say dog. They'll just say, that's another Sparky, right? And the parent's heart goes into their throat because the kid bolts and hugs this strange dog. But to the kid, it's not strange because it looks exactly like the dog he has at home, right? We're going to say breed, German Shepherd, or we might say dog, or we might say mammal, we might say animal. All of those are legitimate, but they're different levels of abstraction. And I thought this was in conformity with what Nevitt's interpretation of Chase was, which is it's more specificity. It's the individualness of what's around and how that is conceived in its individuality rather than abstraction in the primitive world. Chase, am I misunderstanding Heidegger here? Because I don't want to be.
No, I think that's pretty good. I mean, as far as I know, at least. Yeah, okay, I should say this is not really relevant at all, but Ed, your example made me think of a certain story called The Same Dog by Robert Aikman. And if anybody's heard of Robert Aikman, please get in contact with me because I've been looking for people who have read this person as well. Most likely you haven't,
Did he write
in which case.
Snow? Is there a short story called Snow by Nathan? What I'm talking about?
Doesn't ring a bell. Maybe though. But yeah, not really relevant. I'll just leave that there.
The other dog?
No, the same dog.
Oh, the same dog.
Yeah. It's kind of I don't even know why I brought this up. But if you've seen David Lynch films, he's kind of the literary equivalent of David Lynch. And you don't get final resolutions handed to you in a easily digestible format. And a lot of times they will end and you'll be like, what the hell did I just read? Like in the same way a David Lynch film will end, and you'd be like, what the hell did I just watch? But that's good about it. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I don't that's all I got. That's all I got for you.
Uh,
Read
so I do have a question. Where at exactly in the text do we think we are? I'm just trying to get the beat again. You know, we're playing jazz. Some of us started skidding, some of us started scatting. I just want to know what beat we're on.
So we're talking
Just
about
start
the
playing a riff.
All right.
very end of section 17,
Okay.
which was and then this week's reading started at section 18. So the end of last week's was a lot about reference and signs, and then he picks up from there and talks about relevance and significance. So a transition. And I'm just as a completely unnecessary comment, I'm kind of like with Chase on I had a hard time keeping track of the vocabulary at the end of last week's reading, sign, and I can't remember. There was just like a little storm of words, and I was having a hard time trying to figure out what the differences were and how they related to one another. But
when he was going into sign, indication, reference,
Mm-hmm.
I definitely lost. There was a part of me that's just like, how relevant is this? He settled down with sign, and I feel like I took something away from his discussion on signs. But when he opened up that section, I was like, am I about to just be lost forever? But I feel like it's settled down. But I mean, maybe that's an open question I have, and if anybody else. But the
Well,
whole
what-
revelation and like more universal, and this is like all references are relations, but not all. And like I was kind of like, oh shoot.
One thing I took from I was trying to find the passage, and maybe someone else knows it, or maybe I just misread it because I read it kind of quickly today, trying to prepare for this. But I thought there was a part where he was saying like language, like I think he was trying to. I interpreted him as saying that language is not just kind of these abstract things, although it can be that, but it's like it is actually the relation of these uh, things in the world and us in the world with it, like that. It seemed like he was trying to counter this model of language as mere abstraction and to you know and maybe I'm projecting that because there's like that quote by him later Heidegger where he says language is the house of being. That seemed like it was something sort of similar to that, where it's like we are in the world, and so even this like and I can't find, he doesn't say this, but as if he was saying something, like even our syntax and our way of speaking and all of this is uh, downstream of us being in the world, and relating to it as equipment and all the rest of it. I'll look around for the passage, so I'm not just, but maybe someone else knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so I think it's 87 of the German, um, or 86 of the new translation, which that's how I'm going to refer to them now, because I hate saying those names. Those names just like do violence to my brain. But yeah, I think that's okay. I'll just read this. But the significance itself with which Dasein is always already familiar contains the ontological condition of the possibility that Dasein, as understanding and interpreting, can disclose something akin to significations, which in turn found the possible being of words and language. So significations, kind of what that whole passage sort of builds up to, is ultimately signification, and that's this ontological aspect of the world as referential totality for which something can be discovered as relevant. But he's saying that's these significations, that things can be discovered in a context of relations, that's the condition of possibility for the being of words and language. Although in the new translation, they have his marginal notes from his own copy, and it says, untrue, language is not imposed, but is the primordial essence of truth as there.
Yeah, that's the part I was thinking of. Yeah.
But I think that's the difference between, I'm guessing that's a difference between the Heidegger of being in time and the later Heidegger. That what he here in the being in time, he's not saying that. I mean, apparently later he does, but that paragraph that Chase just read suggests that he sees in being in time, he sees language as somehow emerging after the fact, or after these sort of ontological significations, so that linguistic significations are not primary. That's what it sounds like anyway to me in being in time. But then later, you get this footnote where he says, well, I don't think that's the case anymore.
Yeah, that seems to be right to me. Not that I understand Heidegger's theory of language either in being in time or after, but definitely based off what's going on here, where significations is a condition for language, which seems to show that at least language is dependent on significations or whatnot. And then also with this footnote, and so later in this book, I know that he has something about a kind of ontological speech of some kind, like logos, and then there's I think an inauthentic aspect or fallen, or what is the old translation say fallen. So the fallen inauthentic aspect of that as well. But I still think that that doesn't mean that um he's giving language this kind of like primordial aspect, which he seems to be doing in the later Heidegger. So I think that is a distinguishing feature of this transition that he has, this turn from being in time Heidegger to later Heidegger, where language is the house of being and all this. Still don't know what that means, but yeah.
So okay, yeah, this is a section I've been like staring at. It's like the 120, like the 118 to basically the 120 areas, but my margins have a big F on right below 87. And I guess it's like I'm trying to figure out where I'm at as far as like where I want to start poking at it. But it kind of reminded me of, so I put the PDF link to the text that I'm going to refer to in here earlier from Fichte's like essay, but and the essay is like on the origin of like language, and what it seems like he was doing and this is a note that I guess is made inside the text too from the translator of the thing I'm talking about, the book here. It's almost like I wonder if this essay, if he read Fichte's essay at some point, and that was during the transition period. But what it seemed like he like was going on here is that I almost want to agree with Heidegger in virtue of the text, the Fichte's text, but because it just I guess it's like there needs to be the I guess the part I enjoy about it, that I appreciate, is I guess the detachment of thought from language itself, that I'm seeing in Heidegger. It's shared over in the Fichte text, but the big thing is that like Dasein, it's like it's familiar with these relationships. Dasein signifies to itself in a primordial manner. It gives itself both its being and its potentiality for being as something, which it is to understand with regard to its being in the world. And of course, I guess, it reminds me a bit about like Fichte has this section about drive, and of course, drive pushing. I think Heidegger's famously, Dasein's never hungry, never wants to have sex. It doesn't have those drives. And I'm over here like, what's the impetus? What's the drive? It's active. Is this Heidegger's talking about drive here? What is the drive for Dasein to signify itself? And I guess that's the big question that I'm like looking at. Is like, well, what's the drive for Dasein to even do this signifying of itself? I would venture to think that it's maybe just well, as Fichte would say, it's just a free act. And so is that it? What is this thing, Heidegger? I just don't know what's.
Yeah, so I think maybe okay, so yeah, all this is the way that Heidegger presents this, it's all very abstract. I think if I can maybe just somehow try to give at least a concrete sort of example to as far as my way of possibly making sense of this, that could explain sort of what's going on here in terms of that question, which interestingly enough, it was worded in a very kind of like Freudian, Lacanian, Zizekian sort of way. I don't know if making up for the absence of Hunter or what. Um, but yeah, anyways, so okay, so we got a hammer, we got equipment, it's ready to hand, and then we're hammering, it breaks, and then suddenly it becomes apparent to me what the hammer was for. What I was using it for was, this towards which of a context of involvements that I was engaged in, which was building a house. I was building a house. Why was I doing this? I was doing it for the sake of myself, Dasein, because my being is care about my own being, or the being of my being. So I build this house, and equipment is kind of centered in that direction. And so is also this kind of background of significance and everything. But ultimately it's given that significance based off of Dasein and Dasein's being as care, that it cares about its being, and that's why it does that. So in this example, I'm building the house because I want shelter, because I don't want to not have shelter. So yeah, that's why I think he does see it as kind of inherently connected with something that would be like kind of like drive, in the sense that Dasein's being is already kind of inherently connected with this care about its own being. And that's why it does the things it does, why it'll engage in ready to hand equipment and its dealings with the world and all this stuff to begin with. So that's the best way I can at least answer that.
Do you think the care there is an emotional care, or do you think it's more something like, well, you have to take some kind of stance, and if you're going to be any kind of actor in the world, you have to have some kind of objective or end towards which you're acting, and so therefore you have to kind of have something in mind before you start to take any actions.
Yeah, I would say more the latter.
Yeah, like I think like the way I interpret the care and all that is very like there's this Kierkegaardian strain there of like commitment and stuff, although it's not through that kind of same Christian language, but it's like so it's like the structure of your like Kierkegaard would say the structure of yourself, is going to be anxiety and all this, and you got to like commit, go kind of beyond yourself into this like bigger than with yourself thing with Jesus or whatever. That would be like Kierkegaard. But for Heidegger, it's a similar thing where it's like a structural part of your Dasein is that you're always kind of ahead of yourself. You're always like the example Rick Roderick uses when he's talking about is it's like, and we haven't gotten to this stuff yet, but when he's talking about like, but it's related, but like so like being you have a past, a present, and future, but like your future is always ahead of you. It's like, and the example Rick Roderick gives is like retirement. It's like you're always thinking about, you're acting now, but you're doing it in the, your future is part of your present, and that's like, but different Daseins are going to have different kind of projects for themselves that are kind of guiding their commitments and stuff. So in that sense, it's not just an emotion. It's almost like a relation, like to the the project of your Dasein or whatever. I think.
Yeah, I think You could maybe also describe it as it's what establishes the horizon for which then you could maybe have particular emotional concerns and cares and whatnot. But it's kind of, I think he thinks of it as, I mean, yeah, he definitely thinks of it as ontological. So it wouldn't be so much kind of like particular acts that we would do. Instead, it's going to be something that's, infused with our very being that is sets up this whole horizon of our possibilities of what we can do, of how we interpret ourselves, of how we understand our possibilities and all these things. So I mean, it's a complex concept, quite literally, in that it's being in the world and the whole multiplicity of terms that we're going along in this division one of this book is, the world, being in, and all these things. Uh, care is the kind of structure that combines all of them. I'm not using the correct terms there, but he thinks of it as a kind of that's the unity of being in the world, or the meaning of being in the world, I think. Is that right? Something like that. The existential structure of Dasein, I think, is care. I may be wrong about that.
So, in this whole thing, we're talking. I feel like to page 11. I'm gonna use so that I can torture you MNQ. Chase, it's the MNQ version. It's right before 81. I know, like I'm like jump back. Jump back to last week's reading. How dare. Um, but in there he talks about value. There's a paragraph in establishing a sign, however, one does not necessarily have to produce equipment which is not yet ready to hand at all. Blah blah blah. There's a lot of sentences here. But basically, what gets taken as a sign becomes accessible only through its readiness to hand. If, for instance, the south wind is accepted by the farmer as a sign of rain, then this acceptance or the value with which the entity is invested is not a sort of bonus over and above what is already present at hand in itself. Vis-a-vis the flow of air in a definite geographical direction. I only like looking at this investment, this value term that's being thrown here. And I'm just curious, like, why the hell does he drop that? And I guess this section about self-signifying, later on page 120 or section 87, below 87. So earlier, it seems like if it's about care and concern, I mean, maybe it's the case that once I get to this next section, I should just have that in mind when I'm reading this. But it just kind of seems, it almost seems lazy in a way to me for some reason. I don't know why, but I just if it's about me caring, like oh, I'm cold, and that all ontological stuff is being built out of what I would call a drive. I just don't understand like why is that drop suddenly, this investedness that I have with myself. I just don't get that. Chase, I'm not putting it to you. You're not Heidegger's whipping boy, but I put it to the group. What the hell?
There's a part of me that wanted to kind of hear you rephrase your question, but when I read the not a sort of bonus over and above, I don't think he's saying that like we're not caring, but that like kind of like care and concern is like already embedded in just like our relation to like readiness to hand business, equipment, the world. Yeah, maybe I was curious to hear you restate your problem. I don't see him saying that like we're not caring or but more so it's just not a secondary bonus that gets laid on top of like an already present world.
Yeah, so I guess where I'm coming from is that, and again, I'm carrying a torch from one other author over, but I just don't understand the drive. Like, why is drive not is missing here? And I just don't like. It's like the text is too similar to certain other authors that it seems that like the belaboring of building this like beautiful like weird language system that he's running with just I don't know, maybe it's the American in me where it's like, can you say just as clear with less word? And that's where the sensation I'm getting is that Heidegger, I'm enjoying all this like precise, precision that you're trying to add here. But like throw a bone to the people who have said with less word in the past, this thing that you're already talking about, which sounds to me like drive. And that's again as part to self-positing I, blah blah blah. He's embedded in German romanticism and idealism. I mean, like it seems as if it's the language that people have already discussed this, maybe not with his language system, but I think that when you say care as part of like is part of Dasein, I'm like, yeah, I agree. I just call that drive.
I
Well,
wonder
when you say, oh, sorry.
I'm wondering if he's trying to maybe build a different lexicon so that he can
Yeah.
avoid subject. And I'm
Yeah,
wondering
like,
that drive is something that needs to be like a subject that's then laying something over the world, as opposed to, I mean, the idea of like being in the world as a kind of like a whole, as well as like the phrases always already come to mind of like, I don't think he wants to say that there's like something that's being laid over. And I think maybe drive, I'm not sure Fichte and exactly what's going on in the German idealism, but I'm wondering if he's avoiding some of that because he feels like that maybe puts this distinction there that he doesn't want to start from. And I'm recalling too, like a larger piece of his project, right, is kind of trying to resist or short circuit like the arrival at nihilism. And to what extent does like the distinction, if we leave like subject object, if we leave like something like drive as part of a subject, how might that kind of still leave that question open of like we're just imposing things over a present to handed world that still kind of calls into question like why.
yeah, like, but like I'm not. Maybe when you're saying drive, you mean something distinct from how I'm like interpreting the meaning of that, But like I think when Heidegger's saying care, I think like the example that I've heard from Dreyfus, that kind of made it make sense to me was like he talks about, and I think he draws this from Heidegger, maybe in Being in Time or somewhere else, but like he talks about like a woodworker in the forest or whatever, and like a carpenter. And a carpenter, uh, if they're reared as a carpenter, their whole life or whatever, it's like this sort of it takes a kind of they get trained to look at the world a certain way. Like they go by wood, trees and stuff, and the trees, like a curve of a tree that's just out there in the wood, kind of speaks to them for the project that they're building. Let's say they're building a bench or whatever, and they're going to see that tree. If they're a really good carpenter and they've been doing this for years and they're, blah, 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 they're going to relate to that tree in a way that I wouldn't be able to, or any of us, if we haven't, done years of this kind of apprenticeship as like a carpenter or whatever, such that their way of being in the world is actually like different than mine, or like it's more sensitive to this feature of the arena they're in or the environment they're in. And so that's like their care. That's how their care is sort of expressing itself. And it's like it's making, and so that's like their if they're a really great carpenter, and they're building these like really like in Japanese style, there's this tradition where it's like they're making these really beautiful like buildings that just speak for themselves. And you can juxtapose that, or contrast that with our society where we have these these 3/1 freaking like complexes that go up in every city, and they all are homogenized and look the same. And it's like the way we're looking at the wood is to see it as these like 2x4s, where it's all just kind of these like ontically like interchangeable parts. I mean, this is getting at the kind of question concerning technology thing, which is later, but I think that element is how I interpret care. So like, it's like, and so when I hear drive, and maybe you mean something different by this, but or at least like a Freudian drive, it's like, what is the thing that's motivating us? For Freud, it would be like sex or whatever. I just don't think what Heidegger's trying to get at with care is necessarily even mutually exclusive with that. Although maybe someone might correct me on that, but I would think maybe it's just doing its own kind of, he's doing his own thing that's like not trying to explain all of our behavior in the way a drive is, but rather trying to kind of give a portrait of what it is to be a person in the world, and all that. But I'll let other people chime in.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think that unconscious drives are mutually exclusive with what Heidegger's talking about with care. I think that you're right to point out that it's got more to do with how you comport yourself to the world and what sort of things are made available to you. Something that I always think about when we're talking about this is I forget the term, but it's like it has to do with video game design. I think it's called affordance. And like in video game design, there's a kind of like suggestion of like what you should do. And I don't play a ton of video games, but I do play some. And what I've noticed is like it does feel very like you sort of have an idea of like which way a level is supposed to play out, right? And like what you're supposed to be doing there. And sometimes like you'll even have things that you'll feel like really clever for having discovered, like something like I what is the Breath of the Wild, or I forget the Zelda game, but there's a thing you can do right with like metal and like learning how to like let lightning strike it, right? Those kinds of things I feel like are another example or another way of thinking about like what Heidegger means by care. It's like you have a matrix of objectives of things that you're trying to achieve within the world, and those things open up possibilities for ways that you can act in the world. And that's different from saying that, I have like, sure, maybe it could all be determined by sex. I just have a drive to procreate. But on a more metaphysical level, the way that I encounter objects is still, intimately bound up with how how I see myself in the world.
So I think to the problem with drive is precisely as we've mentioned by that there's so many different drives. Whose drive? Freud's drives, Lacan's drive, whose drive we were talking about. And the drive that I'm talking about in particular is and I guess to rely on what I was saying, the only reason I'm bringing this up is because I feel like they're so close. They're so common. Like what Fichte writes in the text I put in the chat and elsewhere seems as if they're so close that it's like, why, like, and Heidegger, I guess, has not thrown bones much at people in the past. But I take the drive for one's like the problem I have with Freud, right, is that my drive is not of my own. It's for the project to produce some other being, or to overcome, or if you're to straight biological terms, people who are like hardcore biological determinists, like my continued existence each day is to stand up and to like go find a mate, so on and so forth. Like that's not the drive that I'm thinking about at all. I think it's much more granular, just like in the same way that like Chase has in here, is care about his own being. That's like that whole segment we can just collapse into drive. That's essentially what that Fichte has in these texts. Like the reason I wriggle on the ground as a child is precisely because like I like through like just spontaneous action of the body to do these various things. They're free actions, and because I don't think Heidegger wants to give away freedom, on and in that. So I'm not so freedom is the primary principle for Fichte. That's like the primary like the I is a product of a free act. I mean that's like any translation I think you get to they'll tell you with that. But so like when I say drive, it's not like I exist, my being exists to go like find mate, eat food, but those are only things about like my care about my own being. And then so I guess what I was trying to say is that I like what Heidegger's writing here. It's so similar that I'm just kind of like, why can't we use language that already exists and is fairly reputable-ish to help pull this out some? I guess that's what I was trying to say more. I didn't want to necessarily be like, I don't know. Was it the case that drive was so inundated as a term by the time he wrote this that it was warranted, like just throwing that out the door? And do we have a philosopher?
Isn't one big difference though is that Fichte is still focused on consciousness and the foundational, so consciousness, it seems to me for Fichte, consciousness is more foundational than being. And being is something that arises out of some project of the self-positing I, or you could say that the self-positing I discovers. Depending on the commentator, I'm never sure which it is. If the self-positing I somehow manufactures this world, or if it discovers the world. But in any case, it's consciousness, the self-positing I, that first encounters things, and so the being of things is not primordial. The being of things is kind of secondary to this primary self-positing I and consciousness. And like you say, the whatever this drive is, it is this drive that is built, that is a manifestation of, or a feature of, or constitutive of this self-positing I. And it seems like Heidegger is he is decentering consciousness, decentering subjectivity, decentering the I, all of that, and making being primordial. And then, because Dasein, like people are dispute this, but Dasein is not a subject, he claims. Dasein is a being in a world of beings, deeply engaged in a world of beings. And and all of his ontological terminology is aimed, it is cast within that framework. And my guess is if he was to use language from German idealism, that he would be using the same kind of language that you have with maybe Heidegger or maybe Hegel less than the others, but that is primarily focused on consciousness as the focal point, as kind of the, again, following Kant, right? And Fichte thinks he's interpreting Kant. Consciousness is kind of the center of the universe. And I think Heidegger's trying to break away from that and trying to break away from the language that is attached to that project.
I shall drop what I'm saying. I shall drop. The defense, has one last statement, which is merely just to say that I am following Beiser, and so Beiser, his primary argument is that Fichte himself is trying to overcome a subject-object relationship, has extending argument for that. So that'd be like my one, and then the other one would just be that I just want to get to, I guess, compare section 31, right? It's in the parentheses here below 87. And I'm only ever having these thoughts because it's the statement of in the act of understanding, which gets us going toward the points that I was drawing out about Dasein signifying to itself in a primordial manner. That's kind of where I was picking at, like Fichte's fact acts, and those creating could be ontological. A fact act producing like this, that is like a concern with being. He's just not using Heidegger's terms because time and various other things. But yeah, so I'm excited to see what happens at 31. Maybe I'll be dissuaded from my opinion that there's some commonalities here. But yeah, so the defense rests. I'm good. We can move on to sentencing.
Should we talk about the Descartes stuff that we? Well,
Yeah, I like so the part about Descartes that I thought was interesting was the section 20 where he starts talking about univocity of being. Got some good potential crossovers there, although he doesn't get into that much about it, except to say that the tradition has left the meaning of being unexamined, starting with the ancients, and it's mainly Aristotle that is kind of set the model for this. That so being can be said of different things. It's the same word, but it's taken to be in different senses that are analogous to each other. But really the problem comes about with the scholastics so what is the difference or the similarity with the fact that we say that God is and man is? Those are they the same thing? Is there the being of God the same being as the being of man? That's what the scholastics were interested in. And so there's the school of the analogy. They would take it as analogy, or the equivocal, yeah, would be that they're different. That when I say God is and man is, that those are fundamentally different. You got infinite being, you got finite being, creator, created, and they only work in they're only the same word conventionally, and the best we can do is understand them as an analogy with each other. And then univocity is they're referred to the same thing, that God is in the same way, in the same sense in which man is. Although he does that, so this is Duns Scotus comes up with this. So that sounds pretty revolutionary to say that. It seems like it's, erasing the difference between God and man, which, for medieval Christianity, like, hope you enjoy burning at the stake. So, but so Duns Scotus, he says this, but then says, but that being is this kind of indifferent commonality that doesn't really amount to much. So it's kind of, everything is kind of being in the same way, and that it's just this indeterminate thing that whatever can be predicated of. So that's kind of the problematic that he's talking about. And it seems like Descartes takes up the position of analogy, that God and humans, man, whatever, that those are the being is not the same way. That substance, which I think that's mainly what Heidegger seems to be concerned with in this section about Descartes is, okay, what is being for Descartes? It's substance. And then what is the meaning of this? It has to do with certain kinds of substances. And the main attribute that characterizes these different substances, that ends up being kind of all there is to these meanings of being that he talks about as substance. So it'd be, extension for res extensa, and then thought, I guess it is, for the mental substance. And then God is, I don't know, infinite substance, being something, its own substance. But then he takes on the same thing of, okay, but what is either the distinction or the commonality between these different ideas of substance here? I think he's want to say like, well, I don't know. We don't really know. It's that substance or being in itself is inaccessible. We only know it through these attributes. So I can only really say what the characteristic of these attributes are. It's extension for bodies, it's thought for minds. That's kind of it. They're maybe analogous to each other, but oh well, who cares? That would be seems to be kind of that's what Heidegger's saying. Descartes is that's sort of his attitude towards this. He's dismissing really, just like the tradition starting from Aristotle to the scholastics are kind of dealing with it, but in a way that is ultimately not really dealing with it, and they're ultimately dismissing it. So we've got Heidegger here to do it for us. Thanks, Heidegger.
Well, as often as the case, I find, and maybe, the first time I read, well, I've read Heidegger a little bit before, but this is the first time I've read him carefully and in depth. And I tend to be a fanboy, initially like, woohoo. And then later on, I'm like, oh, well, God, this wasn't as great as I thought it was. But I'm still a bit in the fanboy mode at the moment. And so when he says stuff like this, I'm like, yes, that's exactly what, like he's articulating these issues about Descartes that were kind of like gremlins kind of scrambling around the back part of my mind, but I couldn't quite figure out what they were chattering on about. And he kind of brings them forward and says and gives them a voice. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. That's what. So anyway, that's my initial reaction to his critique of, and also he also anticipated my question, which I maybe is obvious. Right before this Descartes section, he said, if we're talking about just relations, doesn't this volatilize substance? And I'm like, damn right. Why don't you talk to me about that? And of course, that's what he's going to do. So he sort of anticipated I wouldn't really call it an objection, because I'm willing to after having gone through German idealism and all the kind of craziness that happens there, I'm willing to think that our notion of ontology is, we've got this really old traditional notion of ontology, which just may be very wrong. So, and so the idea of an ontology that's fundamentally relational doesn't strike me as crazy initially, but I'm glad to see him addressing that, because I'm sure. One of the things that I keep wondering, and I haven't had really any analytic ontology or anything like that. It's analytic metaphysics, but I keep hearing these other people, saying, "Oh, this is ridiculous shit." I mean, what really? All these bizarre relational terms. That's not ontology. Ontology is about things, and things having properties and all this kind of stuff. So I'm glad to see him. Well, I hope that's part of what he's doing with Descartes is facing that stuff head on, and helping us shut up those little analytic demons that are always buzzing about my head.
Hey, don't say anything bad about demons. Demons are awesome. Analytic philosophers, not so much.
Actually, there's a book, I can't remember what the name of it was, but I saw just in passing a year or two ago, there's a book about philosophy's demons, and it's talking about like Descartes' demon and just all these different little demons that have shown up in the whole history of philosophy and what kind of function they served. So
Oh, really? If you remember the name of that book, I would be interested in that.
I'll try to
'Cause,
see
yeah,
if I
I've definitely got an interest in the philosophy of demons. Um, but yeah, so one thing that I was thinking of just in terms of Descartes and his ontology, and one of the things that I noticed about this was, okay, so his definition of substance is kind of, what stands on its own, what can be self-subsisting, seems somewhat kind of like synonymous. I think he's kind of giving the definition with the, yeah, anyways. So that's fine. I guess, that's substance, but then that seems like it doesn't actually apply to any of these individual substances. A human body, is not a substance based off that definition. So it depends on its whole relational context and background and all kinds of things. I mean, even from, his Christian perspective, obviously dependent on God. And then, so Heidegger kind of talks about this and says that, well, the way that this is kind of, they played around with this and subverted it was, well, there's kind of like a relative substance where at least this substance is not dependent on any other created thing. And I just see that as that is not satisfying to me. Maybe because I'm already looking through like a Spinoza's sort of lens, where Spinoza is just like, yeah, there's only one substance possible based off this definition. And yeah, it doesn't make any sense to have two things that are completely self-subsistent. That's not going to work. So yeah, I don't know. Seems like Spinoza makes sense with the definition, where Descartes is still trying to put it in this kind of medieval hierarchical sort of ladder of being kind of thing, where it just doesn't work because there's only really only God would be the only real substance theoretically. Everything else, like, what the hell is all these other things that are exactly not self-subsisting? So yeah, I don't know if I really had a point. It's kind of like my complaint that Heidegger helped me see more clearly, I guess.
No, I agree with you. I was thinking of Spinoza as well. Like I got to when I got to the end of 19, I was just like, oh, okay, well, like Spinoza, it seems like we could just make recourse to Spinoza a little bit on while we throw Descartes out the window, possibly into the fire in his cabin. But yeah, that's yeah, I was enjoying it as well. Like it seemed like a very even-handed takedown. I don't know if that's the way to put it. You mean it was kind of, there's no, I don't think there's no, I don't know if there's any space to contend to try to save Descartes here. I just don't think there's any space.
I'll
yeah, I
defend.
mean, to me, it just no, go ahead. I've talked too much.
I'll defend Descartes a little bit. I think that maybe there's a little bit of intentional misrepresentation initially because at a later part, Heidegger talks about other properties that Spinoza considers, and then Spinoza will say, "Oh no, but that already presupposes something." And initially, when he's talking about substantiality, Heidegger seems to have in mind something like um, origin, like I depended on two parents who created me, or something like that, right? Like I have an origin, and there was something that happened that had to happen causally before the thing could show up. But Descartes' particular example that Heidegger even points out with something like color, where you could say, the wall is white, presupposes something like space in mind, right? And that has nothing to do with causality, as the space was there first, and then the wall could be painted white, right? So I don't know. That's at least something that I feel is maybe a bit uncharitable initially by Heidegger, although I was confused because, like I said, he seems to point to it directly shortly thereafter.
So I do know that in this section immediately after, well, I think there's one more section just purely on not Heidegger, on Descartes, and then he goes into this section on space, and that's gonna. I think that's actually okay. I think the next reading is going to be the next one section on Descartes, and then he's going to get into these three sections, I think, on space. And what he's doing is contrasting Descartes' conception of space as extension, which is obviously going to be the whole present at hand thing, and then his idea, which is this existential spatiality, which is very different. So I guess yeah, it seems like we'll see more exactly about this topic for the next reading, at least.
I feel like there was a hint of that when he was talking. I mean, but I read it quickly, so maybe I had a feeling that's where he's going, and so I was reading into what he was saying. But when he talks about hardness and like Descartes' sort of analysis of hardness or whatever, seemed like he was kind of, because he was like saying that thing about how it's, what if you're trying to push in a thing and it just went on forever? Like, then there would be no hardness, And so when he was saying that, I interpreted him as saying that even hardness is kind of relative to Dasein, like our being in the world and relating to it, like it's not this distinct property, like it's just hard. It's like hard for Dasein, y'all know what I'm talking about? Or did I misread that?
No, I think I know what you're
I think,
talking about. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's good.
I think it's plausible, yeah.
And another thing I want to say as something that Heidegger points out, so the traditional notion is that, like James was saying, is that you have some features that must inhere in something and some that don't. So, color cannot exist on its own. It has to inhere in something. So you have these secondary qualities, or these what was the term he used in here? Accidents or whatever, that have to inhere in something. And the things that they inhere in is a substance. So the substance is the thing that has this kind of its substantial being. But then one thing that I think part of what Heidegger is pointing out is that this constellation of concepts, there's just a lot of incoherency. And so, for example, the one that he points out that that I draw out actually in my 1305 class is that for Descartes, that notion of substance as that in which things inhere, you can have no experience of it by definition. You cannot experience substance because the only thing you can experience are exactly the secondary qualities, the sensory properties. So you can experience the superficial colors and so the notion of saying, so it's an entirely theoretical notion. Well, color can't exist on its own, so it must inhere in something. Well, let's call that substance. And then, Hume comes along being a radical empiricist, and he says, I'm not willing to give you anything that you can't have sensory access to. And so what that means, Descartes, is your notion of substance is meaningless. That word substance is like saying square circle. You can say those words, but it doesn't mean a damn thing. And so, I mean, while I agree, there's a sort of there's an appeal to saying there seem to be these qualities that must inhere in something, but again, you can't. And for Descartes, being a rationalist, he says, well, that's not a problem because substance is an innate idea. It's an innate idea that reveals to us there is this underlying substance that exists in the world to which we necessarily have zero empirical access. But because I have an innate idea of it, I know that that's what's going on out there. But again, it points to these problems with that traditional substance ontology.
Well, I don't have anything, guys, to be honest with you. I don't have a thing after that, but I guess for next week, just like I'm about to hop off and go eat. But where are we going to next? Like we're getting all the way through the 3 parts of spatiality, right?
I'd have to look at.
I think until the end of chapter 3, I believe.
20 pages seems very reasonable. Yeah, 23. That's how much we had to go forward in the MQ. But
yeah, it's kind of quite a lot for. I mean, Heidegger's very dense, but I think that was the only way to get it where chapter 4 would be all on its own. So.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to it because I don't know if I can say anything about Descartes without the I don't know. I'm getting the critique, the negative, and I need I guess to have anything insightful to say, I would need to get the positive end so that I know why he's going there. So I don't have anything to say. I've enjoyed tonight. I'm making an effort to be here for Mondays going forward, mainly because I don't know, like this stuff has been good for me in some way. I don't know. It's kind of gross. But yeah, I'll see y'all next week.
Okay, see you next week.
Peace.
So anybody else have any final insights, comments, rude comments about Hunter?
Okay, I was hoping Hunter would be here so I could get I agree. Hunter does suck. Not really. Hunter's awesome, but we'll say he sucks also at the same time. Why not? I think Hunter would be cool with a nice contradiction there. Hunter sucks.
I don't know why he's so easy to hassle. I don't know why.
Yeah, something about him. I don't know.
Maybe because
if he was here, we could ask him about that. But he's not, so instead we just say he sucks and yeah. Well, so I've gotten in a 2-day debate about pessimism with someone I know, and there's something of a Lacanian and have defined suffering as lack and all this stuff, and I was thinking like I need help. Like, is just like Lacan, like, does this make any sense to other Lacanian like perspectives? I don't know. So I wish Hunter was here so I could be like, so I know he definitely seems to flirt himself with pessimism in some way. All this like negativity, lack stuff. How does that cross over into value judgments? I don't know, but Hunter's
I
not
should know
here.
nothing
He
about
sucks.
Lacan.
So yeah.
I am Lacan ignorant.
Yeah, me too. Very much by
Mm.
choice. I bought the book and it's collecting dust on the shelf. I don't know, maybe one day. One day maybe.
I will, I mean, this is probably not at all helpful, but just as far as suffering goes, because I've been influenced both by Nietzsche and by Zen, I think of suffering as resistance to the will. Although that's a very broad, that's like dukkha, which is not just like necessarily like, suffering. Like,
Mhm.
well, Matthew and I had a discussion. It's just like,
Thirst. Yeah.
just gonna grumble. So I think of suffering as that, but that may have absolutely nothing to do with Lacan.
Yeah, Buddhist, like dukkha translates, at least that conception of suffering is like just a wheel that's all fucked up, like a shopping cart wheel that's just wobbling, and it's just god damn it, like so we it gets translated into life as suffering, and it sounds very epic, and it sometimes is like but it's like you're in Gaza or something, and that's horrible, or you're just trying to shop, and there's this fucking wheel that's just like off. And you're like, God damn it. Like this fucking wheel. So
Yeah,
Hunter,
and if
that's
you
his
think,
whole experience is a series of, neurotic encounters with everything around him. He's sort of like Larry David in that way. He's got that stranded.
I have a
Yeah.
quick question about secondary material. I don't have anything other than the book being in time, and I know that people. I think you were recommending the Dreyfus book,